It hits you before you ever glance at your financial statements. The climbing lease payments, the power invoice that was once irritating but now induces genuine fear, the supermarket run that mysteriously demands more from your wallet every single month. Currently, countless Americans are awakening, reporting to their jobs, enduring exhausting commutes, and still confronting the same silent, agonizing inquiry. These represent actual circumstances, not sensationalized headlines or exaggerated narratives. They're genuine individuals. A young professional who deposits funds into her emergency savings each pay period only to immediately withdraw them for transportation fuel and food supplies. An employee laboring 6 consecutive days weekly, traveling 4 hours daily merely to reach his workplace, acknowledging he can no longer finance the singular activity that brings him satisfaction. Households examining $600 electricity invoices and questioning what mistakes they're committing. The reality is, they're committing no errors whatsoever. Because if you've ever searched cost of living in America 2025 through Google, you comprehend what's unfolding. Compensation isn't matching pace. Necessities demand more than previously, and the divide between merely surviving and genuinely living has never appeared more substantial. This presentation transcends mere statistics. It concerns the authentic reality underlying those figures. It addresses comprehending why everything carries such expense, how circumstances reach this point, and what implications exist for ordinary Americans who sense they're sprinting simply to maintain their position. Remain through the conclusion, because grasping the framework represents the initial step toward avoiding being overwhelmed by it. The initial observation when hearing contemporary younger Americans isn't indolence, excessive demands, or unreasonable anticipations. It's fatigue, not the variety emerging from an extended workday, but the type originating from battling a framework that seems increasingly burdensome annually. Among the narratives that resonated most profoundly, a 20-something female responds to older commentators, instructing her to simply labor more intensively, the identical approach they pursued historically. Her reply is direct and unfiltered. It's not identical. You destroyed this nation. Underlying the frustration exists something more profound, exasperation that the guidelines her parents operated under simply no longer exist. And she's accurate regarding one element: the economic terrain has transformed in manners older generations never confronted. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, compensation and residential property still progressed somewhat together. You could acquire housing in your 20s without requiring a 6-figure salary or a decade's accumulated savings. A university credential didn't necessitate assuming obligations that pursue you into middle adulthood. Healthcare expenditures, childcare expenses, automobile payments all remained dramatically reduced relative to earnings. Presently, inflation adjusted, the typical employee earns approximately equivalent to a worker from 1979, while fundamental living expenses have detonated by over 70%. This doesn't concern assigning blame to one generation. It addresses acknowledging that America's financial foundation has fundamentally shifted. Accessible credit and minimal interest percentages inflated asset valuations for decades, causing residential properties and investments to escalate dramatically. Corporate consolidation indicates fewer enterprises controlling greater portions of the necessities we cannot survive without, from food supplies to utilities to medical services. When merely a handful of entities dominate a marketplace, costs don't simply increase. They remain elevated regardless of how intensely households struggle. And whereas older generations frequently maintained one full employment position that comfortably supported a household, younger generations confront an economy where even dual employment barely maintains bill payments. The consequence is a form of psychological dissonance. Individuals are instructed to replicate identical steps their parents executed, labor diligently, save consistently, exercise intelligent decisions. But the mathematics simply doesn't validate the promise anymore. The admission cost into middle-class stability has climbed faster than wages, faster than opportunities, and faster than optimism. So when young individuals push back and declare it's not identical, they're not requesting sympathy, they're requesting honesty. Would you concur that today's American economy demands increased effort for diminished rewards than a generation previously? For millions of Americans, the residential crisis isn't an abstract graph or a discussion topic topic on broadcasts. It's the moment you remain seated in your vehicle after an extended shift and question yourself how you'll manage rent the following month. One female in Florida captures this flawlessly. She remits $1,300 in rent, a $650 automobile payment, $300 for insurance coverage, and still maintains utilities, groceries, and everything else accumulated above. Her voice fractures as she states, "I either consume food or I remit my invoices." And even then, it's like, which invoice will arrive late this month? That isn't financial mismanagement. That's housing expenses outpacing the average American paycheck, and the statistics validate her experience. The median residential price throughout the nation sits approximately $410,000 to $420,000, nearly 6 times the median household earnings. A proportion that previously was 3 to 1 has doubled within a generation, transforming property ownership into something requiring fortune equally as hard work. Even leasing, which previously was the accessible alternative, has become its own ascending struggle. A typical single-bedroom apartment now averages approximately $1,500 monthly nationwide, lower than the 2022 peak certainly, but still roughly 15% elevated than before the pandemic. In numerous cities like San Diego, New York, Boston, and Miami, that identical single-bedroom easily extends to $2,500 or $3,000. Housing hasn't cooled, it simply achieved a new expensive standard. Why is this occurring? It's not one reason. It's a perfect tempest. For years, America didn't construct sufficient homes to satisfy demand. Construction decelerated following the 2008 crash and never completely recovered. Simultaneously, mortgage percentages climbed from historic minimums to 6% and 7%, slamming the entrance on first-time purchasers. Investors, ranging from individual landlords to massive institutional purchasers, stepped in and acquired tens of thousands of residences, transforming starter houses into rental inventory. In states like Florida and Texas, property insurance has skyrocketed due to climate hazards, pushing monthly ownership expenses even higher. When shelter becomes both scarce and expensive, there exists no pressure for prices to decline. Families are forced to compete, and competition propels the figures upward even more. The impact isn't merely financial, it's generational. The average first-time residential purchaser is now in their mid-30s, the oldest age ever documented. Renting has become a permanent condition for many, not a temporary phase. Without home equity, wealth disparities widen. Individuals feel trapped not because they won't labor hard, but because the entry doors to stability are secured behind rising expenses and shrinking alternatives. And even for those who manage to secure a roof above their heads, the narrative doesn't conclude there. Because once you obtain the keys, an entirely new collection of invoices arrives. Invoices that frequently hit harder than the rent itself. Let's discuss those concealed expenses next. For numerous Americans, the shock doesn't originate from the rent or the mortgage. It originates from everything stacked surrounding it. The invoices you cannot avoid, the ones you don't even contemplate until they materialize in your mailbox and make your stomach plummet. One woman recently shared her electrical statements from a scorching summer in Texas: $560 for June, $650 for July, and a projection that August would push her past $2,000 in merely 3 months. She wasn't operating a luxury residence, she wasn't squandering power, and she wasn't living extravagantly. She was cutting expenses everywhere possible. Cooking at home, avoiding unnecessary acquisitions, and it still wasn't sufficient. And although her invoice is on the extreme end, it reflects a nationwide trend. On paper, the average electric invoice sits approximately $150 monthly, but that figure collapses under real-world conditions. In states with prolonged heat waves, older grid frameworks, or heavy air conditioning usage, $400 to $600 invoices are common during peak months. Water expenses have risen sharply across many major cities. Broadband is now a near mandatory household expenditure, and car insurance rates have spiked nationwide. Taken individually, each increase seems manageable. Together, they form a second rent. Then there's the expense of reaching work. A man shared his routine, driving nearly 4 hours every day, working 6 days a week, and realizing he no longer possesses the time or budget for the simple activities he enjoys. He's not overreacting. Car payments tell the identical story. The average monthly payment for a new vehicle is now over $700. with many drivers paying more than $1,000. Used cars aren't cheap either, and between insurance, gas, maintenance, and rising interest rates, transportation has become one of the largest financial drains on the typical household. But the deeper issue isn't merely price, it's necessity. Most Americans don't possess reliable public transit. They cannot choose to skip owning a car the way people in dense cities or other countries can. Work is often far from home, and remote options don't exist for millions of jobs. The commute trap reinforces the cycle. You need a car to earn money, but a huge portion of that money goes right back into the car. All of this adds up to a sensation many people quietly share, that life has become a long list of non-negotiable payments attached to simply existing. Not luxuries, not upgrades, just survival. And when even those basics stretch the budget to its limit, the next place people look is the one cost they cannot avoid any longer: food. The grocery aisle is where many finally realize how tight things have become, and that's where we're going next. If there's one place where the cost of living crisis strikes every single American, it's the grocery store. You can negotiate your rent, delay a car repair, skip a vacation, or cut streaming services, but you can't stop eating. And that's exactly why so many people are losing control of their budgets in the aisles of Walmart, Aldi, Costco, and local supermarkets. One young woman expressed it perfectly when she said she attempts to save money every time she gets paid. She sets aside a little, promises herself she won't touch it, and then 2 days later, she's pulling it right back out. Not for luxuries, not for impulse shopping, for food, gas, the basics required to get through the next 2 weeks. Every time I put money in my savings, she says, I end up needing it for something essential. That isn't bad planning. That's a sign the essentials themselves have become too expensive. The data tells the identical story. According to updated government food plans, a single adult today typically spends between $300 and $400 monthly on groceries, depending on the city and dietary plan. And even after the pandemic era spikes, prices still rise roughly 2% to 3% every year. The painful truth is that food inflation never fully reversed. It just slowed down while staying at a higher baseline, which means every paycheck buys a little less than it did the year before. But it's not just the price, it's the type of food people can access. In many neighborhoods across the country, especially low-income or rural areas, large grocery stores have closed or consolidated, leaving food deserts behind. These are communities where residents must rely on convenience stores, dollar stores, or fast food chains because there's no major supermarket nearby. Fresh produce becomes harder to find and more expensive. Meanwhile, heavily processed foods stay cheap. The economic result is predictable. Families trying to stretch their dollars end up buying what's affordable, not what's healthy. This creates a hidden cost that most Americans feel but rarely talk about. Eating cheaper today can mean paying more later through higher medical bills, lower energy levels, and stress that compounds with every tough financial decision. Parents ration portions, skip meals, or replace fresh ingredients with shelf-stable alternatives because the math demands it. The grocery bill becomes a source of anxiety, not nourishment. And when even the most basic necessity feels like a financial burden, many people ask the same painful question. If buying food is this hard, what chance do I have with everything else? That sense of falling behind doesn't end at the checkout line. It follows people home and shows up in their bills, their credit cards, and the debt they carry month after month. That brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the growing reliance on credit just to stay afloat. For a growing number of Americans, survival is no longer paid for with cash. It's financed, not because people are chasing luxury, but because the basic cost of living has outpaced what their paychecks can cover. One of the clearest examples comes from a creator who laid out her monthly bills: rent, electric, water, car payment, car insurance, groceries, and gas. Then she asked the question so many families quietly whisper at their kitchen tables: which one of these can I skip this month and try to catch up on later? That's not irresponsible budgeting. That's a system where income and expenses no longer match. Credit cards step in as the buffer, but they come with a price. Over the last year, American households have pushed total credit card balances to over $1.2 trillion, the highest level ever recorded. The average interest rate now sits above 22%, which means any balance carried from month to month grows faster than most people can pay it down. A $5,000 balance can easily turn into thousands more in interest alone if someone can only make minimum payments. And the majority of people carrying these balances aren't doing it for vacations or gadgets. Surveys show nearly half of cardholders use their credit cards to pay for essentials, groceries, rent gaps, utility bills, or unexpected car repairs. Medical costs only make the situation harder. Even with insurance, high deductibles and out-of-pocket expenses push families into using credit just to cover routine care. Emergency room visits, specialist appointments, prescriptions, none of it waits for someone to save up. Health issues don't pause for inflation, and when a bill arrives before a paycheck, the credit card becomes the only option. Over time, these cycles create a quiet pattern. Debt becomes normal, interest becomes expected, and financial breathing room disappears. At the same time, wages have struggled to keep up. When incomes stagnate but prices rise, debt fills the gap. It becomes a tool people rely on, not because they want to, but because they have to. It's a bridge between the life someone is working for and the life they can currently afford. But it's also a trap, because every month that balance grows, tightening the financial pressure that millions already feel. What makes this even more difficult is the emotional weight. People know they're trying their best. They're budgeting, cutting costs, and doing everything they can to stay responsible. Yet the math still pushes them into relying on borrowed money. And with each swipe, the sense of falling behind deepens. If the essentials of life require financing, what happens to a person's stability, confidence, or long-term goals? And how does this constant pressure shape the way Americans view their future? That's what leads us directly into the final piece of this picture: the toll all of this takes on mental well-being and the fading promise of the American dream. When you listen to Americans talk about the rising cost of living, there's a moment when the conversation stops being about money and becomes something much heavier. It's the point where people admit they're tired in a way that sleep can't fix, tired of working long hours, tired of racing against bills, tired of feeling like progress is always one step out of reach. One creator described his routine: 6 days a week at work, nearly 4 hours of driving a day, and no time or energy left for the simple things he enjoys. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He was trying to make sense of a life where effort and reward no longer match. And that experience isn't unusual. Studies show that a majority of Americans report feeling stressed about their finances on a daily basis. Rising rent, unpredictable utility bills, mounting debt, and the pressure to keep up create a sense of constant strain. Even when people do everything right, budget carefully, work extra shifts, cut non-essential spending, they still feel like the ground is moving beneath them. This isn't about personal failure. It's about living in an economy where the cost of stability has climbed faster than most people's ability to pay for it. The emotional impact is real. Financial pressure influences relationships, family dynamics, and long-term planning. Parents worry about providing for their children. Young adults question whether they'll ever afford a home. Workers wonder if they'll ever reach a point where they're not just catching up. People begin to feel disconnected from the future they imagined because the path toward it keeps getting narrower. This is where the idea of the American dream comes into the conversation, not as nostalgia, but as a measure of how expectations have changed. For decades, the promise was simple: work hard, make good decisions, and life will gradually get better. That promise feels more fragile now. Home ownership is delayed by a decade. Savings accounts don't grow fast enough to keep up with rising costs. Economic mobility, the belief that each generation will do better than the last, has slowed. People are not giving up on ambition. They're running into barriers that previous generations didn't face. Yet, even with these challenges, many Americans still hold on to something important: the belief that life shouldn't just be about getting by. They want time with family, space to breathe, the ability to plan for the future, not perfection, just stability. That desire itself is evidence that hope hasn't disappeared. It has simply become harder to reach under the pressure of today's economy. Which brings us to the final question: if the system feels this heavy, what can people take away from understanding it? And how do we make sense of a future where the cost of living keeps rising faster than the opportunities meant to support it? Let's bring all of this together in the conclusion. When you step back and look at everything together: the housing crunch, the rising utility bills, the grocery aisle shock, the reliance on credit, and the pressure it puts on people, It becomes clear this isn't just an economic story, it's a human one. The cost of living in America 2025 isn't measured only in dollars, it's measured in stress and time lost, in the dreams people keep postponing because the basics take so much out of them. But understanding the system doesn't mean accepting it. It means recognizing that these pressures aren't personal failures. They're structural barriers that millions are facing at the same time. The real question now is, which part of this reality feels closest to your life? Housing, food, debt, or the feeling of running just to stay level? And if this breakdown helped you see why is everything so expensive with a clearer perspective, hit subscribe and share this video, because no one should have to navigate this economy alone.